They were told a black man would never hold the heavyweight championship of the world, that he lacked the discipline, the intelligence, the very character needed to stand in the ring with white champions. Yet on a scorching day in Sydney, Australia, Jack Johnson would shatter every assumption and rewrite the rules of what was possible. The white boxing establishment thought it was absurd. Conversations in smoky gymnasiums and prestigious athletic clubs dismissed the very notion. A black heavyweight champion? The idea was treated as a joke, something to laugh about over cigars and whiskey. These men believed in a natural order, a hierarchy they assumed was written into the fabric of existence itself. At the top stood white champions, symbols of superiority and dominance. Below them, everyone else. The thought of a black man claiming the sport's ultimate prize wasn't just unlikely to them, it was inconceivable, offensive, a threat to everything they believed about the world. In boxing circles across America, when Jack Johnson's name came up in the early 1900s, it was met with sneers. Sure, he'd won some fights. Yes, he'd defeated black opponents, and even some white boxers willing to face him. But the heavyweight championship? That was reserved for men like John L. Sullivan, James J. Corbett, and the current champion, Tommy Burns. These were the names that mattered, the faces on newspaper covers, the heroes of a nation that saw boxing as a test of manhood and racial superiority. Johnson was an outsider, unwelcome in their world. When he pursued a title shot, he was ignored, mocked, told he'd never get his chance. The color barrier in boxing wasn't unofficial, it was blatant. After the first black heavyweight champion, John Arthur Johnson, no relation, the white establishment had drawn a line. No black man would get another shot at the title. Sullivan himself had declared he would fight any man alive, except a black one. But Jack Johnson refused to accept those boundaries. Born in Galveston, Texas, in 1878, he grew up in poverty, the son of former slaves. His childhood was marked by hunger, hard labor, and the constant weight of Jim Crow's boot on his neck. But Johnson had something that couldn't be beaten out of him, an unshakable belief in his own worth. He taught himself to box on the streets and in small clubs, fighting for pennies, learning to read opponents, to move with grace and power, to think 3 steps ahead. By his 20s, he was already exceptional. Not just physically gifted, though he was that, tall and powerfully built with reflexes that seemed supernatural. But Johnson had something else, intelligence. He studied his opponents obsessively, watched how they moved, identified their patterns and weaknesses. He was a tactician in an era when most fighters relied on brute strength. What separated Johnson from every other black boxer of his era was his refusal to play the role white America expected. He didn't bow his head or speak softly. He didn't apologize for his success or downplay his abilities. Johnson was flamboyant, confident to the point of arrogance. He wore fine clothes, drove expensive cars, and dated white women openly, each act a middle finger to the segregated society trying to keep him in his place. This made him dangerous, not just in the ring, but to the entire social order. A successful black man was tolerable, only if he knew his place. But Johnson acted like he had no place, like he belonged everywhere and nowhere. He lived as if the rules didn't apply to him, and in doing so, he terrified white America. By 1908, Johnson had defeated every fighter willing to face him. He'd chased Tommy Burns, the white heavyweight champion, across continents. Burns, a Canadian, had defended his title against various opponents, but refused to fight Johnson. The money wasn't worth the risk of losing to a black man. But Johnson was relentless. He followed Burns to England, to France, taunting him in newspapers, calling him a coward. The pressure mounted. Finally, an Australian promoter offered Burns an enormous purse to fight Johnson in Sydney. Burns accepted, confident he would win and silence the upstart once and for all. The white press predicted an easy victory. They wrote that Burns' superior boxing intelligence and experience would overcome Johnson's physical gifts. Some didn't even bother to hide their racism, writing openly that a white man would naturally prevail over a black opponent. Johnson arrived in Australia months before the fight, training publicly, giving interviews, projecting supreme confidence. He told reporters he would win easily, that Burns wasn't in his class. The Australian press ate it up, some fascinated by this brash American, others appalled by his audacity. How dare a black man speak this way about a white champion? But Johnson didn't care. He'd spent his life being told what he couldn't do, couldn't say, couldn't be. He was done listening. December 26th, 1908, Boxing Day. The venue was Rushcutters Bay in Sydney, an outdoor stadium hastily constructed for the fight. Over 20,000 people packed in, most expecting to see Burns defend his title and put Johnson in his place. The atmosphere was electric, tension thick in the summer heat. As Johnson entered the ring, the crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered, curious to see if this confident challenger could back up his words. Others jeered, yelling slurs, making their feelings clear. Johnson smiled, waved, looked utterly unbothered. He'd heard worse. Burns entered to louder cheers, the crowd firmly behind him. The champion looked confident, ready to prove that the natural order would hold. The referee gave instructions. The fighters returned to their corners. The bell rang, and within seconds, it was clear that everything the white boxing establishment believed was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Johnson moved like nothing Burns had ever faced. His footwork was elegant, his defense impenetrable. Burns threw punches that Johnson dodged with minimal effort, making the champion look slow and clumsy. And when Johnson countered, his punches landed with devastating accuracy. By the second round, Burns was already in trouble. Blood streamed from his mouth. His eye was swelling. Johnson wasn't just beating him, he was dominating him, toying with him, speaking to him between punches. "Come on, Tommy. You can do better than that." The smile never left Johnson's face. He was enjoying this, relishing every moment of proving them all wrong. The crowd's cheers turned to shocked silence. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The white champion was supposed to win, was supposed to show natural superiority. Instead, he was being systematically dismantled by a man they'd been told couldn't possibly beat him. Round after round, the beating continued. Burns showed courage, refusing to quit, but he had no answer for Johnson's skill. By the 14th round, the fight had become difficult to watch. Burns was a bloody mess, barely able to defend himself. Finally, police entered the ring and stopped the fight, declaring Johnson the winner. The crowd sat in stunned silence. Some booed. Others simply stared, unable to process what they'd witnessed. Jack Johnson was the heavyweight champion of the world. A black man held boxing's ultimate prize. Everything they believed about racial hierarchy, about the natural order, had just been shattered in front of 20,000 witnesses. Johnson stood in the center of the ring, arms raised, grin wide. He'd done it. Against every obstacle, every insult, every attempt to keep him down, he'd reached the top. But as he would soon discover, winning the championship was only the beginning of his fight. White America would not accept what had happened in Sydney. They would spend the next decade trying to take his title, trying to break him, trying to find anyone who could restore the natural order they believed in. The laughter had stopped. In its place came something more dangerous: rage, fear, and a desperate search for a great white hope who could put Jack Johnson back in his place. But standing in that ring in Sydney, championship belt around his waist, Johnson wasn't thinking about what came next. He was savoring the moment, the vindication, the proof that everything they'd told him about his limitations was a lie. He'd beaten their champion. Now he'd have to survive their backlash. Before Jack Johnson could enjoy his championship, he had to face the fury of a nation that refused to accept what he'd accomplished. Winning the title was one thing. Keeping it while black in America was another battle entirely. The news from Sydney hit America like a punch to the gut. Newspapers across the country ran headlines announcing Johnson's victory, and the reaction was immediate and visceral. In the South, there were riots. White mobs attacked black communities, as if Johnson's victory was a crime his entire race needed to answer for. In New York, angry whites assaulted black citizens on the streets. In cities across America, the pattern repeated. A black man had won something he wasn't supposed to have, and white rage demanded payment in blood. The sporting press, which had dismissed Johnson before the fight, now scrambled to explain what happened. Some gave him grudging credit, acknowledging his superior skill, but many refused to accept the result at face value. They claimed Burns had been ill, past his prime, caught on a bad day. They argued that any number of white boxers could defeat Johnson if given the chance. The solution, they insisted, was to find a great white hope, a white champion who would reclaim the title and restore the proper order of things. This wasn't subtle. The racism was explicit, discussed openly in newspapers and magazines. Writers proclaimed that white pride demanded Johnson be defeated. The search for his conqueror became a national obsession, a quest treated with the seriousness of a military campaign. Johnson returned to America as champion, but he wasn't welcomed as one. He was viewed with suspicion and hostility, seen as a threat rather than a hero. In most of the country, he couldn't eat in white restaurants, stay in white hotels, or use white facilities. Champion or not, Jim Crow still applied. But Johnson refused to live like a second-class citizen. He bought expensive cars, multiple houses, dressed in custom-made suits. He opened his own nightclub in Chicago, the Café de Champion, a luxurious establishment where black and white patrons mixed freely, scandalous for the era. Most controversially, he dated and married white women. This, more than anything else, made him a target. Interracial relationships were illegal in many states and socially taboo everywhere. For a black man to publicly date white women, to flaunt those relationships, was seen as the ultimate transgression. Johnson didn't just date white women, he was open about it, appeared with them in public, married them in ceremonies covered by the press. Each relationship was treated as a national scandal, proof of his degeneracy, evidence that he needed to be stopped. But Johnson wouldn't hide. He'd spent his life being told where he belonged. Now, as champion, he belonged wherever he wanted to be. The boxing world scrambled to find someone, anyone, who could beat him. Former champions were urged to return. Stanley Ketchel, a middleweight, fought Johnson in 1909 despite being significantly smaller. The fight was supposed to be an exhibition, but Ketchel tried to knock Johnson out with a surprise punch and briefly succeeded in flooring him. Johnson got up furious and knocked Ketchel unconscious with a single punch that reportedly shattered his teeth. The Great White Hope search intensified. Promoters scoured the country and Europe for a white boxer who could challenge Johnson. They found James J. Jeffries, a former champion who had retired undefeated. Jeffries was reluctant, enjoying retirement on his farm, but the pressure was enormous. The press painted it as his duty, his obligation to white America. Finally, in 1910, Jeffries agreed to return to the ring. He would be the Great White Hope, the man who would put Johnson in his place and restore white supremacy in the boxing ring. The fight was scheduled for July 4th, 1910, in Reno, Nevada. Independence Day. The symbolism wasn't subtle. This was positioned as a battle for American identity, for white pride, for the very soul of the nation. The buildup was unlike anything boxing had seen. Newspapers covered every detail of both fighters' training camps. Jeffries, 35 years old and significantly heavier than his fighting weight, struggled to get in shape. Johnson trained confidently, telling reporters he would win easily. The press largely dismissed his predictions, convinced that Jeffries, despite the layoff and age, would prevail. On the day of the fight, over 20,000 people descended on Reno. Millions more followed via telegraph updates and special bulletins. This wasn't just a sporting event. It was a national referendum on race, a test of white supremacy's validity. The crowd was overwhelmingly pro-Jeffries, hostile to Johnson. When he entered the ring, jeers rained down. Johnson smiled and waved, unbothered as always. The bell rang, and within moments, it was clear Jeffries was in trouble. 6 years of retirement had taken their toll. He was slow, his timing off, his power diminished. Johnson, in his prime at 32, was faster, sharper, stronger. He didn't just beat Jeffries, he humiliated him. For 15 rounds, Johnson dominated, landing punches at will, talking to Jeffries and the crowd between combinations. "Come on, Mr. Jeff. Let me see what you got." The smile never left his face. He was enjoying this, savoring every moment of proving them wrong again. Jeffries' corner threw in the towel in the 15th round. Johnson had won by technical knockout. The Great White Hope had failed. The reaction was immediate and violent. Race riots erupted across America. In over 50 cities, white mobs attacked black communities. At least 20 people were killed, hundreds injured. The violence was collective punishment for Johnson's victory, as if his success was a crime requiring retribution. In the South, black people were lynched for celebrating Johnson's win. The message was clear. A black man might hold the title, but black people as a whole would pay the price for his audacity. The government responded by banning films of the fight. Congress passed legislation prohibiting the interstate transport of fight films, specifically to prevent images of Johnson defeating white opponents from being shown. They couldn't erase what happened, but they could try to hide the evidence. Johnson's victory celebrations were muted by the violence. He'd won again, proven his superiority again, but the cost was being paid by people who had nothing to do with the fight. This was the burden he carried, the impossible position he occupied. Every victory made him a target and put his community at risk. But he wouldn't stop being who he was, wouldn't bow to the pressure to be humble or apologetic. The backlash pushed Johnson into a kind of exile even while he remained champion. Many Americans refused to fight him. Those who did were often past their prime or outmatched from the start. Johnson defended his title successfully, but couldn't get the fights he wanted against the best available competition. White fighters avoided him, knowing that losing to Johnson meant more than just a defeat. It meant humiliation and the wrath of white America. The federal government began looking for ways to bring Johnson down. If they couldn't beat him in the ring, they'd use the law. In 1912, Johnson was indicted under the Mann Act, a law prohibiting the transport of women across state lines for immoral purposes. The charge was based on his relationship with Lucille Cameron, a white woman who would become his wife. The case was transparently about race, an attempt to punish Johnson for his relationships with white women. When Cameron refused to testify against him, prosecutors found another woman, Belle Schreiber, and built a case around their past relationship. The trial was a spectacle. The prosecution focused less on the specific charges and more on Johnson's lifestyle, his wealth, his relationships, his refusal to know his place. Johnson was convicted in 1913, sentenced to a year and a day in prison. Rather than surrender, he fled the country, beginning a 7-year exile. He fought in Europe and South America, still champion, but unable to return home. The title he'd fought so hard to win had made him a fugitive. This was the price of his refusal to accept limitations, the cost of living without apology. The American nightmare was that a black man could be champion and refused to be humble about it. Johnson embodied that nightmare, and America would punish him for it in every way possible. Before Jack Johnson could reclaim his place in America, he would spend 7 years wandering foreign lands, still champion, but increasingly isolated, the target of a relentless campaign to strip him of everything he'd won. Johnson's exile began in 1913, when he fled to Canada and then to Europe, staying one step ahead of authorities determined to imprison him. He was still heavyweight champion, still the best boxer in the world, but the circumstances of his reign had fundamentally changed. He couldn't defend his title in America, the heart of the boxing world. Instead, he fought exhibitions and occasional title defenses in places like Paris and Buenos Aires, always moving, never able to settle. In Europe, Johnson found a measure of freedom he'd never had in America. Paris, especially, welcomed him. The French had less rigid racial hierarchies, and Johnson became a celebrity in the city's nightlife. He performed in music halls, appeared at fashionable parties, lived the life of a star. But beneath the glamour, the pressure was building. He was separated from his country, his community, his home. The exile wasn't just physical, it was emotional and financial. The legal fees from his trial and the costs of living abroad were draining his resources. When World War I broke out in 1914, Europe became increasingly dangerous and unstable. Johnson moved to South America, then to Spain, always searching for the next opportunity, the next payday. His fights during this period were fewer and less significant. The best American boxers still wouldn't face him, and the European competition wasn't at the same level. Johnson was aging, in his late 30s by 1915, still formidable, but no longer in his prime. The years of hard living, the stress of exile, the constant legal troubles, all were taking their toll. Yet he remained undefeated, still the champion, still refusing to surrender the title. But the walls were closing in. The US government continued to pressure him, using diplomatic channels to make his life difficult wherever he went. His ability to earn money was restricted. Promoters were wary of dealing with a fugitive, especially one the American government wanted badly. By 1915, Johnson was tired. Tired of running, tired of fighting battles outside the ring, tired of being away from home. He began secret negotiations with the Justice Department, trying to arrange a return to America. He was willing to serve his sentence if he could come home on his terms, with guarantees about his treatment. The government wasn't interested in deals. They wanted him to surrender unconditionally, to submit completely. Johnson refused, maintaining what dignity and leverage he still possessed. Then came Jess Willard, a massive white boxer from Kansas, standing 6'6" and weighing well over 250 pounds. Willard was being built up as the latest great white hope. He wasn't particularly skilled, but his size and power made him dangerous. More importantly, he was white and willing to fight Johnson. A match was arranged for April 1915 in Havana, Cuba. The 26-round bout would be for Johnson's heavyweight championship. At 37, Johnson was giving away youth, size, and reach. But he was still the champion, still confident he could win. Or was he? The events in Havana have been debated for over a century. What's known is this: Johnson controlled the early rounds, boxing circles around Willard, landing punches at will. But as the fight progressed, Johnson slowed. The Cuban heat was brutal, and conditioning became a factor. Willard, younger and fresher, kept coming forward, absorbing punishment, but landing heavy shots of his own. By the 20th round, both men were exhausted. In the 26th round, Willard landed a right hand that dropped Johnson to the canvas. The champion lay on his back, shielding his eyes from the sun with his arm, and was counted out. Jess Willard was the new heavyweight champion. The Great White Hope had finally succeeded. White America celebrated, relief washing over a nation that had spent 7 years unable to accept a black champion. But almost immediately, questions arose. Had Johnson thrown the fight? A famous photograph shows him on the canvas, lying almost peacefully, arms shielding his face. It doesn't look like a man who's been knocked unconscious. It looks like someone who's decided to stay down. Johnson himself told different stories over the years. Sometimes he claimed Willard beat him fairly. Other times, he hinted at a fix, suggesting he'd agreed to lose in exchange for leniency from the US government. The truth is likely complicated. Johnson was aging, worn down by years of exile and hard living. Willard was younger, bigger, and fresh. It's entirely possible Johnson simply lost, that the years finally caught up with him. But it's also possible he saw an opportunity to end his exile, to give white America the result they desperately wanted in exchange for being allowed to come home. Whether the fight was legitimate or fixed, the result was the same. Jack Johnson was no longer champion. The title he'd held for 7 years, the symbol of everything he'd fought for, was gone. Willard would hold it for 4 years before losing to Jack Dempsey, who would become one of boxing's biggest stars. Johnson's era was over. He returned to the United States in 1920, surrendering to authorities. He served his sentence at Leavenworth Penitentiary, working in the prison and giving boxing exhibitions for inmates. When he was released after 10 months, he was 42 years old, broke, and yesterday's news. The boxing world had moved on. But Johnson wasn't done. He continued to box into his 50s, taking fights wherever he could find them, exhibitions and matches against younger fighters who saw him as a relic. He won some, lost others, but mostly he was surviving, trying to make money any way he could. The fortune he'd earned as champion was long gone, spent on legal fees, high living, and the costs of exile. He worked various jobs, appeared in vaudeville, told stories about his glory days to anyone who would listen. The man who had been heavyweight champion of the world, who had broken barriers and defied a nation, was reduced to hustling for paychecks and reminiscing about what he'd once been. It was a fall as dramatic as his rise, a reminder of how quickly fortune can turn and how little mercy the world shows to those who transgress its rules. But even in decline, Johnson maintained his dignity. He never apologized for who he'd been, never expressed regret for his choices. He'd lived on his own terms, paid the price for it, and refused to pretend he'd been wrong. That defiance, that unbreakable sense of self, remained until the end. Before we can understand Jack Johnson's true legacy, we need to see how his life rippled outward, touching everything from sports to civil rights to the very definition of black masculinity in America. Johnson died in 1946 in a car accident, speeding away from a diner in North Carolina that had refused to serve him because of his race. Even at 68, still defiant, still refusing to accept limitations. His death came 3 years before Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier, 8 years before Brown versus Board of Education, 2 decades before the major victories of the civil rights movement. Johnson didn't live to see the fruits of the seeds he'd planted. For decades after his death, Johnson's legacy was complicated and contested. In the black community, he was remembered with mixed feelings. Some celebrated him as a pioneer who had refused to bow to white supremacy, who had lived freely and unapologetically. Others saw him as reckless, believing his flamboyance and relationships with white women had invited unnecessary persecution and made life harder for other black Americans. This tension was real. Johnson's actions had consequences beyond himself. The riots after his victories, the backlash he faced, the way white America used him as a justification for oppression. All of this affected millions who had no connection to boxing. Was it fair to blame Johnson for white America's racism? Of course not. But the question of how to resist, how publicly to defy unjust rules, has always been complicated. In the white mainstream, Johnson was largely forgotten or remembered as a cautionary tale, a troublemaker who got what he deserved. His boxing achievements were acknowledged, but downplayed. Histories of the sport often rushed past his championship years, focusing instead on white champions like Dempsey and Lewis, the latter of whom was embraced because he played the role of humble champion that Johnson had refused. It wasn't until the civil rights movement that Johnson began to be seriously reconsidered. In the 1960s and 70s, black activists and intellectuals looked back at Johnson and saw something different, a prototype of black pride and self-determination. He'd lived without apology in an era when that was nearly impossible. He'd refused to let white America define his worth or limit his possibilities. Writers like Miles Davis and Muhammad Ali cited Johnson as an inspiration. Ali, especially, saw himself in Johnson's tradition. Ali was similarly brash, confident, willing to say and do things that made white America uncomfortable. Like Johnson, Ali faced government persecution for his choices, was stripped of his title, spent years in exile from the sport. The parallels were striking, and Ali acknowledged them openly. In the 1970s, a biographical play called The Great White Hope brought Johnson's story to Broadway, starring James Earl Jones. The production was a hit, introducing a new generation to Johnson's life and legacy. A film adaptation followed, earning Jones an Oscar nomination. Suddenly, Johnson was back in public consciousness, reassessed as a tragic hero rather than a cautionary tale. But the full rehabilitation took decades. In 2018, 105 years after his controversial conviction, President Donald Trump granted Jack Johnson a posthumous pardon. The symbolic importance was significant, an official acknowledgement that the charges against Johnson had been unjust, racially motivated, a misuse of government power to punish a black man for living freely. Johnson's impact on boxing is undeniable. He changed the sport fundamentally, introducing defensive techniques and strategic thinking that influenced generations of fighters. His style, emphasizing movement and defense as much as offense, was revolutionary in an era when most heavyweights simply stood and traded punches. Every defensive wizard who followed, from Willie Pep to Floyd Mayweather, owes something to Johnson's innovations. Beyond technique, Johnson proved that black fighters could compete at the highest level, opening doors for the champions who followed. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, became heavyweight champion in 1937 and was embraced by white America in ways Johnson never was. But Louis's acceptance came partly because his handlers carefully managed his image, ensuring he appeared humble and non-threatening. This was a direct response to Johnson, a calculated effort to avoid repeating his perceived mistakes. Louis played by rules Johnson had refused, and it worked differently for him. Whether that was better or worse is a matter of perspective. Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, every black boxing champion who followed, walked paths Johnson had carved out, even if they took different routes. Johnson had proven it was possible to be champion despite white America's resistance. That knowledge, that precedent, mattered. But Johnson's influence extended far beyond sports. He was one of the first black celebrities, someone whose fame transcended his profession. His lifestyle, his fashion, his cars and clubs and romances, all of it created a template for black celebrity that would be replicated and expanded by entertainers and athletes for generations. The Harlem Renaissance figures of the 1920s, the jazz musicians and writers and artists who celebrated black culture and achievement, were working in a landscape partly shaped by Johnson's refusal to be diminished. His relationships with white women, while controversial and dangerous in his time, challenged one of white supremacy's most sacred taboos. The violence his romances provoked revealed the depth of white America's investment in racial separation, particularly sexual racial separation. By refusing to hide those relationships, Johnson forced America to confront its obsessions and hypocrisies. The backlash was brutal, but the challenge was real and lasting. Johnson also demonstrated the limits of individual success in a systemically racist society. He'd reached the pinnacle of his sport, earned wealth and fame, and still couldn't escape discrimination. He was still refused service at restaurants, still subject to harassment, still targeted by the government. His experience illustrated that personal achievement, no matter how extraordinary, couldn't overcome structural racism. This lesson would be learned again by countless successful black Americans who discovered that excellence doesn't guarantee equality. In contemporary times, Johnson's story resonates in ongoing debates about athlete activism and the expectations placed on black public figures. When Colin Kaepernick knelt during the national anthem or LeBron James spoke out on social issues, they faced backlash rooted in the same dynamics Johnson encountered. The belief that black athletes should be grateful for their opportunities and stay quiet about injustice. The parallel is direct. Johnson wouldn't stay quiet, wouldn't play humble, and America tried to destroy him for it. Today's athletes fighting similar battles are walking in his footsteps, whether they know his story or not. Johnson's life also speaks to questions of respectability politics, the idea that marginalized groups should be on their best behavior to avoid provoking oppression. Johnson rejected this completely. He refused to moderate his behavior to make white America comfortable. He lived as he wanted, and when they came for him, he didn't apologize. Some saw this as admirable courage. Others saw it as selfish, a failure to consider how his actions affected other black Americans. Both perspectives have validity, and the tension between them persists in discussions of how to resist injustice. Before we celebrate Jack Johnson as a symbol, we need to remember he was a human being who paid an enormous personal price for his refusal to conform. The man behind the legend carried wounds that never fully healed. Johnson's personal life was turbulent and often tragic. His relationships with women, particularly white women, were central to both his public image and his private suffering. His first wife, Etta Duria, was a white socialite from Brooklyn. Their marriage in 1911 was controversial, but by all accounts, they loved each other genuinely. Etta struggled with the constant scrutiny and racism directed at their relationship. The press portrayed her as a fallen woman, a race traitor. She faced ostracism from her family and former friends. The pressure was crushing. In September 1912, Etta committed suicide, shooting herself in their Chicago home while Johnson was away. He was devastated, blaming himself for bringing her into a life she couldn't withstand. The press showed little sympathy, some outlets suggesting her death proved interracial marriage was unnatural. Johnson mourned deeply, but publicly maintained his characteristic bravado, perhaps because showing vulnerability would have been seen as weakness. Just months after Etta's death, Johnson married Lucille Cameron, another white woman. This relationship became the basis for his Mann Act prosecution. Lucille stayed with him through the trial and into exile, but the marriage was troubled. The stress of their circumstances, Johnson's infidelities, and their lifestyle took a toll. They eventually divorced in 1924. His third marriage, to Irene Pino in 1925, was more stable, but still marked by financial struggles and the shadow of his past glory. Irene stayed with him until his death, enduring poverty and obscurity alongside the former champion. The toll of Johnson's lifestyle was visible in his later years. The money was gone, spent on legal fees, high living, and the simple costs of surviving as a fugitive and then as a former champion trying to make ends meet. He took whatever work he could find, often demeaning jobs that required him to trade on his past fame. He appeared in carnival sideshows, performed in vaudeville acts, worked as a bouncer. The man who had been heavyweight champion of the world was reduced to whatever would pay the bills. The psychological cost was equally heavy. Johnson lived with constant surveillance and harassment. Even after serving his sentence, authorities kept tabs on him. Local police in various cities would arrest him on trumped-up charges, holding him overnight just to remind him of his place. The message was clear. You might have been champion, but you're still a black man in America. The stress of this existence wore him down. Friends from his boxing days reported that Johnson in his later years could be melancholy, prone to dwelling on what he'd lost and how he'd been treated. The confident, smiling champion who had taunted opponents from the ring had been replaced by an older man carrying the weight of decades of persecution. Yet Johnson never publicly expressed regret. In interviews late in life, he defended his choices, his lifestyle, his refusal to bow. When asked if he would have done anything differently, he said no. He'd lived as he wanted, loved who he wanted, refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose. The price had been high, but the alternative would have been losing himself. This stubborn dignity, maintained through poverty and obscurity, might have been his greatest victory. Johnson also carried the burden of knowing how his actions had affected others. The riots after his victories, the violence inflicted on black communities, the way his success was used as justification for oppression. None of this was his fault, but he lived with the knowledge of it. Some in the black community blamed him, argued he'd been reckless, that he should have been more careful, more aware of how his actions would be weaponized. This criticism hurt him deeply. He'd never apologized for who he was, but he understood the complicated position he occupied. He was a symbol whether he wanted to be or not, and symbols carry weight beyond themselves. The isolation of his later years was profound. The boxing world had moved on. Younger champions took center stage, and Johnson's accomplishments faded from public memory. He'd attend fights sometimes, sitting in cheap seats, watching the new generation while spectators who didn't recognize the old man in their midst. Former friends and associates drifted away. Some had profited from him during his glory days and disappeared when the money ran out. Others simply moved on with their lives. Johnson was left largely alone, a living ghost haunting the edges of the sport he'd once dominated. His health declined in his final years. Decades of boxing had taken their toll. He suffered from various ailments, could no longer move with the grace that had made him unbeatable. But he remained active, restless, unable to settle into quiet retirement. He still drove too fast, still sought excitement, still refused to slow down. On June 10, 1946, Johnson was driving near Franklinton, North Carolina. He'd just been refused service at a diner because of his race. Angry, he sped away and lost control of his car, crashing into a light pole. He was rushed to St. Agnes Hospital in Raleigh, where he died from his injuries. He was 68 years old. Even in death, racism followed him. The hospital was segregated, and Johnson died in the colored ward, the same second-class treatment he'd fought against his entire life. His funeral was held in Chicago, the city where he'd owned nightclubs and lived as champion. A few hundred people attended, mostly from the black community that had never forgotten him. The mainstream press gave his death minimal coverage. Boxing magazines ran brief obituaries. The man who had been one of the most famous athletes in the world passed away with little fanfare. He was buried at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, his grave marked by a simple stone. For decades, it was largely forgotten, visited occasionally by boxing historians and people who remembered his story. Only in recent years, as his legacy has been reassessed, has his grave become a pilgrimage site for those who understand what he represented. The personal cost of Johnson's life choices was staggering. A dead wife, a lost fortune, years in exile, a decade in obscurity and poverty, constant persecution. And yet, when you look at the totality of his life, it's hard to say he should have done it differently. If he'd been humble, if he'd apologized, if he'd played by their rules, would they have treated him better? History suggests not. Joe Louis played by the rules and was still cheated financially, still faced discrimination, still died in debt. The system wasn't designed to reward black excellence, no matter how it was packaged. Johnson chose to live freely, and he paid for it. But he also lived authentically, on his own terms, refusing to be diminished. That choice, and the price it carried, defined his life and his legacy. Before Jack Johnson could become a symbol of resistance, he first had to be a living, breathing challenge to every assumption white America held about black masculinity, intelligence, and worthiness. Johnson didn't just fight in the ring. He fought with his entire existence, and in doing so, he helped reshape how black Americans saw themselves. In the early 1900s, the acceptable image of a successful black man was narrow and constricting. Booker T. Washington, the era's most prominent black leader, preached accommodation and gradual progress. He argued that black Americans should focus on economic self-improvement, vocational training, and proving their worth through hard work and respectability. Washington believed that if black people showed they were industrious and moral, white America would eventually grant them equality. Johnson represented the opposite philosophy. He didn't ask permission, didn't wait for white approval, didn't believe he had to prove anything to anyone. He took what he wanted, lived as he pleased, and dared the world to stop him. This was revolutionary. For black Americans growing up under Jim Crow, taught from childhood to be deferential and careful, Johnson's example was both inspiring and terrifying. He showed what was possible, but also what it cost. In black newspapers and barbershops, in churches and pool halls, Johnson's career was debated endlessly. Was he a hero or a liability? Was his defiance admirable or reckless? These conversations revealed deep tensions within the black community about the best path forward. Some argued that Johnson's behavior invited backlash that hurt everyone. Others celebrated him for refusing to accept second-class status. The debate itself was significant. It showed black Americans grappling with fundamental questions about identity, strategy, and dignity. Johnson forced these conversations by simply being who he was. His influence on black culture went beyond politics. He was a style icon, a trendsetter. His custom suits, his cars, his nightclubs, all of it created a vision of black excellence and luxury that inspired others. In Harlem and Chicago, in every black urban center, young men imitated Johnson's style, trying to capture some of his confidence and flair. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, that explosion of black artistic and cultural achievement, happened partly in Johnson's wake. The writers, musicians, and artists of that movement were working in a cultural landscape that Johnson had helped transform. He'd proven that black Americans could compete and win on the world stage, could demand attention and respect, could refuse to be invisible. Musicians especially connected with Johnson. The boldness of his life, the way he lived publicly and unapologetically, resonated with jazz musicians who were creating a new, distinctly black art form. Jazz, like Johnson, refused to play by established rules. It was improvisational, defiant, rooted in black experience, but claiming universal appeal. The parallel wasn't accidental. Johnson's life and jazz both represented a new kind of black self-expression, confident and unapologetic. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance, like Claude McKay and Langston Hughes, referenced Johnson in their work. He appeared as a character, sometimes directly, sometimes as an archetype, the new Negro who refused old limitations. These writers were articulating a vision of black identity that Johnson embodied, proud rather than apologetic, demanding rather than asking. But Johnson's cultural impact wasn't limited to high art. He influenced everyday life, the way ordinary black people thought about themselves and their possibilities. In barbershops and beauty parlors, his victories were celebrated, his style was discussed, his life was analyzed. He became part of the folk culture, a figure about whom stories were told and retold, often exaggerated, but always admiring of his refusal to bow. The conversations about Johnson also revealed class tensions within Black America. Middle-class black leaders often disapproved of him, seeing him as uncultured and damaging to racial progress. They preferred leaders like Washington, who emphasized education and economic advancement through conventional means. Working-class black Americans were more likely to celebrate Johnson, seeing in him someone who'd risen from poverty and refused to be told what to do by anyone, white or black. Johnson's relationship with white women was perhaps his most controversial cultural contribution. In an era when black men were lynched for even looking at white women the wrong way, Johnson married them, appeared with them publicly, and refused to hide the relationships. This was more than personal preference. It was political dynamite. It challenged the sexual obsessions underlying white supremacy, the fears of black male sexuality that justified so much violence. By refusing to accept this taboo, Johnson struck at the heart of racial control. The backlash proved how central sexual policing was to the entire system. The rage Johnson provoked by loving white women revealed that racism wasn't just about segregation or economics. It was about controlling bodies, desires, intimacies. White America's obsession with Johnson's romantic life showed their true fears. This legacy is complicated. Some argue Johnson's relationships with white women were progressive, a refusal of racist boundaries. Others point out that his preference for white women could be seen as internalized racism, a rejection of black women. Johnson did have relationships with black women, but his marriages were all to white women, and this pattern is worth examining. What's clear is that his choices forced conversations about interracial intimacy, desire, and the artificial boundaries racism created. Those conversations continued through the civil rights era and into the present, whenever interracial relationships sparked debate or controversy. Johnson also influenced how black athletes saw themselves and their role in society. Before Johnson, black athletes who achieved success often felt pressure to be humble and grateful. Jack Johnson showed another way: confident, proud, willing to antagonize. This provided a template that later athletes would follow or react against. Joe Louis explicitly positioned himself as the anti-Johnson, humble where Johnson was brash, careful where Johnson was reckless. But Louis's approach was shaped by Johnson's example, defined in opposition to it. Muhammad Ali, conversely, saw himself in Johnson's tradition. Ali was brash, confident, willing to antagonize white America. He spoke his mind, made political statements, paid the price through years of exile from boxing. The parallels to Johnson were obvious, and Ali acknowledged them. He studied Johnson's life and saw a predecessor who had walked the same path. Contemporary athletes grappling with questions of activism and public image are still navigating terrain Johnson helped map. When athletes speak out on social issues, when they refuse to shut up and play, they're following a path Johnson carved. The backlash they face echoes the persecution Johnson endured. The fundamental question remains the same. Do black athletes have the right to be fully themselves, to speak freely, to challenge injustice? Or must they be grateful, humble, non-threatening? Johnson answered that question with his life, and his answer continues to resonate. The cultural revolution Johnson sparked was about more than sports or celebrity. It was about the right to self-definition, the refusal to let others dictate who you could be or how you should act. This is why his legacy matters beyond boxing statistics or championship reigns. He expanded what was possible for Black Americans, showed that the rules could be broken, that dignity didn't require permission. Before we can fully appreciate Johnson's cultural impact, we need to understand his revolutionary approach to boxing itself. He wasn't just a champion, he was an innovator who fundamentally changed how the sport was practiced. In the early 1900s, heavyweight boxing was a brutal, straightforward affair. Fighters stood toe-to-toe and traded punches until someone went down. Defense was secondary to offense. Courage meant taking punishment without flinching. The great champions before Johnson, fighters like John L. Sullivan and Jim Jeffries, embodied this approach. They were tough, powerful men who overwhelmed opponents through sheer force. Sullivan famously boasted that he could lick any man alive, and for years, he backed it up. Jack Johnson approached boxing differently. He understood that not getting hit was as important as hitting. He developed defensive techniques that were revolutionary for his era. His footwork was exceptional, allowing him to move around the ring with a grace unusual for a heavyweight. He could circle away from power punches, pivot out of danger, control distance with subtle movements. His defense was built on positioning and timing, rather than just blocking or slipping. He'd make opponents miss by inches, conserving energy while frustrating them. Then, when they were off balance or fatigued, he'd counter with precise, powerful punches. This defensive mastery was rooted in intelligence. Johnson studied his opponents obsessively. He'd watch their previous fights if possible, noting patterns and tendencies. He'd observe them during the early rounds of his fights, letting them reveal their strategies before adjusting his own approach. One opponent recalled, "Fighting Johnson was like fighting a ghost. You'd think you had him, throw your best punch, and he wouldn't be there. Then suddenly, his fist would be in your face, and you'd wonder how it got there." This intelligence extended beyond physical technique. Johnson was a master psychologist in the ring. He'd talk to opponents during fights, mocking them, questioning their manhood, undermining their confidence. "Is that your best? Come on now, you can hit harder than that." The smile was part of his psychological warfare. While being punched in the face, Johnson would grin, making opponents feel their best shots meant nothing. This was devastating to morale. Fighters would throw everything they had, and Johnson would smile and ask for more. The famous photograph of Johnson standing over Tommy Burns shows this perfectly. Burns is on the ground, defeated. Johnson stands above him, looking down almost casually, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. That image captured Johnson's approach. Calm, confident, completely in control. His clinch work was also ahead of its time. When opponents got inside, Johnson would tie them up, smother their punches, control their arms. He'd lean on them, tire them out, make them carry his weight. Then, he'd push off, create space, and land combinations before they could reset. This wasn't flashy, but it was effective, turning his opponent's aggression into exhaustion. Johnson's jab was a weapon of precision. He'd use it to measure distance, set up power punches, or simply accumulate damage. A jab doesn't look devastating, but hundreds of them over 15 or 20 rounds destroy a man's face and break his will. Johnson understood boxing as a marathon rather than a sprint. Many of his fights went 15, 20, even 26 rounds. Conditioning was crucial, but so was pace management. Johnson would start slowly, feeling out his opponent, boxing at a comfortable rhythm. If his opponent rushed, trying to force a quick knockout, Johnson would weather the storm, defend, survive. Then, as rounds accumulated and exhaustion set in, he'd take control. His power was deceptive. Johnson wasn't a one-punch knockout artist like some later heavyweight champions. His power was more insidious, accumulative. He'd land clean punches round after round, breaking opponents down gradually. By the late rounds, they were battered, demoralized, ready to quit. The stoppage would come not from a single dramatic knockout, but from the accumulated damage of hundreds of precise, powerful punches. His uppercut was particularly devastating. Johnson had long arms and used his reach to keep opponents at distance, but when they got inside, his uppercut would be waiting. It came from below their line of sight, drove through their guard, snapped their heads back. Many opponents were hurt badly by Johnson's uppercut, their legs wobbling, defenses collapsing. Technically, Johnson was virtually flawless. His balance was perfect, even when moving or throwing combinations. He never left himself open unnecessarily, always maintained his guard, kept his chin tucked. These fundamentals, drilled into modern boxers from day one, were not universal in Johnson's era. He developed and refined them through intelligence and experience. But perhaps Johnson's greatest gift was his adaptability. Every opponent was different, required a different approach. Against aggressive brawlers, Johnson would box, use movement and defense to frustrate them. Against cautious boxers, he'd press forward, use his size and strength to impose his will. He could fight going forward or backward, inside or outside, slow or fast. This versatility made him nearly impossible to game plan against. You couldn't prepare for Jack Johnson because you never knew which version you'd face. Modern boxing analysts studying Johnson's fights are struck by how contemporary his approach seems. The defensive techniques, the psychological warfare, the strategic thinking, all of it would be familiar to today's champions. Johnson was decades ahead of his time, pioneering approaches that wouldn't become standard until much later. This innovation came from necessity. Johnson knew he'd face opponents backed by the entire weight of white supremacy. Referees might be biased, judges might rob him, the rules might be manipulated against him. He couldn't afford to leave any doubt. He had to be so much better that bias couldn't overcome his superiority. This pressure forced him to develop a style that minimized risk and maximized control. The irony is that Johnson's genius has been somewhat obscured by the racism surrounding his career. Because so much attention focused on his personal life, his racial defiance, and the controversy of his championship, his actual boxing skill sometimes gets overlooked. But boxing historians who study his fights recognize him as one of the greatest defensive fighters ever, a technical master whose innovations influenced every generation that followed. Sugar Ray Robinson, widely considered the greatest pound-for-pound fighter in history, studied Johnson's techniques. Muhammad Ali borrowed Johnson's psychological tactics and defensive approach, making them even flashier and more theatrical. Floyd Mayweather's defensive mastery owes a debt to techniques Johnson pioneered. Every boxer who prioritizes defense, who studies opponents, who uses movement and timing over pure aggression, is fighting in a tradition Johnson established. His legacy in the sport itself is immense, even if it's sometimes forgotten in the broader narrative of his life. Johnson proved that a thinking fighter could beat a strong fighter, that intelligence could overcome brute force, that boxing was as much chess as warfare. This understanding transformed the sport, elevated it from mere brawling to an art form requiring skill, strategy, and discipline. Before Jack Johnson could be broken by the system had to weaponize every tool at its disposal to bring him down. The campaign against him reveals the lengths white supremacy would go to destroy a black man who refused his assigned place. The Mann Act, officially titled the White Slave Traffic Act, was passed in 1910 to combat forced prostitution. Its stated purpose was to prevent the transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes. In practice, it became a tool to prosecute interracial relationships and punish men whose sexual conduct offended moral guardians. Johnson was the perfect target. Federal prosecutors had been looking for ways to bring him down since his championship victory. Local authorities in various cities had arrested him on dubious charges, but nothing had stuck. The Mann Act provided the weapon they needed. The first attempt to use it against Johnson came in 1912, shortly after he married Lucille Cameron. Prosecutors tried to build a case around their relationship, but Cameron refused to cooperate. She testified on Johnson's behalf, insisting their relationship was consensual and that she loved him. The case collapsed, and they married shortly after. Undeterred, prosecutors found Belle Schreiber, a white woman Johnson had been involved with years earlier. Schreiber was willing to testify against him, claiming he'd transported her across state lines for immoral purposes. The case was built on events from years before the Mann Act even existed, a retroactive prosecution that legal scholars later recognized as constitutionally dubious. But in 1913, with anti-Johnson sentiment running high, legal niceties didn't matter. The trial was a circus. The prosecution focused less on the specific charges and more on Johnson's lifestyle, his wealth, his cars, his nightclubs, his relationships. They painted him as a moral degenerate, a threat to white womanhood, a symbol of everything wrong with racial equality. Johnson's defense attorneys argued the case was racially motivated, that white men engaged in similar behavior without prosecution. They were right, but it didn't matter. The all-white jury deliberated briefly before returning a guilty verdict. Johnson was sentenced to a year and a day in federal prison. Rather than report to custody, he fled. With Lucille, he traveled to Canada and then to Europe, beginning his 7-year exile. The government's pursuit didn't end with the verdict. Federal agents tracked Johnson's movements abroad, used diplomatic pressure to make his life difficult wherever he went. They contacted local authorities in various countries, warning them about Johnson, suggesting he be monitored or harassed. This international manhunt was unprecedented for what was essentially a morals charge. It revealed how desperately white America wanted Johnson brought down. The State Department's involvement in hounding a prizefighter shows the level of resources dedicated to his persecution. Meanwhile, the government's case against Johnson was recognized by many as unjust. Some legal scholars spoke out, arguing the prosecution was politically motivated and legally questionable. Black newspapers covered the case extensively, pointing out the obvious racial double standard. White men transported women across state lines for immoral purposes constantly, without prosecution. The law was being selectively enforced against Johnson because he was black and refused to be humble about his success. But these criticisms didn't lead to any reconsideration. Johnson remained a fugitive, unable to return home without facing imprisonment. The government's message was clear. A black man could be champion, could be wealthy and famous, but if he stepped too far out of line, the full power of the state would be brought against him. When Johnson finally returned to the United States in 1920 and surrendered to authorities, he was processed through the criminal justice system like any other convict. The former heavyweight champion of the world, a man who had been celebrated in European capitals, was fingerprinted, photographed, and sent to Leavenworth. His time in prison was relatively benign by federal prison standards. He was assigned to the physical training department, gave boxing lessons to inmates, and was treated with a measure of respect by prison authorities who recognized his celebrity. But it was still prison, still confinement, still punishment for a crime that existed primarily to give the government a tool to prosecute him. After serving 10 months, he was released. The conviction would follow him the rest of his life, a permanent stain used to diminish his accomplishments. When his boxing career was discussed, the conviction was always mentioned, often prominently, as if it were as important as his championship reign. This was intentional. The government and its supporters wanted to ensure that Johnson's legacy was tainted, that he would be remembered as a criminal rather than just a champion. The selective prosecution of Johnson had broader implications. It sent a message to all black Americans about the limits of success and the consequences of stepping out of place. No matter how high you rise, the system can bring you down. Excellence won't protect you. Fame won't shield you. If you threaten the racial order, you will be punished. This lesson wasn't lost on the generation that followed. Joe Louis, who became champion in 1937, was carefully managed to avoid Johnson's fate. His handlers ensured he appeared humble, patriotic, non-threatening. He was told explicitly not to be photographed with white women, not to gloat over victories, not to give white America any excuse to turn on him. This worked differently for Louis. He was embraced by white America in ways Johnson never was, became a national hero during World War II. But the cost was his authentic self-expression. Louis had to perform a role, had to be the good Negro to Johnson's bad Negro. The fact that this was necessary shows the effectiveness of the government's campaign against Johnson. They'd made an example of him, and the lesson was learned. The posthumous pardon Johnson received in 2018, 105 years after his conviction, was an official acknowledgement that the prosecution had been unjust. President Trump, making the announcement, called it a disgrace that Johnson had been treated this way. Boxer Sylvester Stallone and others had advocated for the pardon for years, arguing that history demanded this correction. But a posthumous pardon, while symbolically important, can't undo the damage. Johnson lived and died as a convicted felon, his reputation tarnished, his legacy complicated by a prosecution that was always about race rather than justice. The pardon acknowledged the injustice, but came far too late to help the man who suffered it. The government persecution of Jack Johnson stands as one of the clearer examples of the criminal justice system being weaponized against a black man who refused to know his place. There was no real crime, only the crime of being successful, visible, and unapologetic while black. The law was twisted, selectively enforced, and backed by the full power of the state to punish this transgression. Before we close Jack Johnson's story, we need to ask what it means now, over a century after he knocked out Tommy Burns and claimed a title the world said he couldn't have. His life speaks to recurring patterns, timeless questions, and struggles that continue today. First, there's the lesson about challenging unjust systems. Johnson didn't accept the color barrier in boxing. He didn't accept that his place was beneath white champions. He pursued what he wanted despite every obstacle, and eventually, he broke through. This pattern repeats throughout history. Unjust barriers hold until someone refuses to accept them and fights through regardless of cost. Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat, Jackie Robinson breaking baseball's color barrier. Every boundary crossed required someone willing to pay the price of being first. Johnson's example teaches that change often requires this kind of individual courage. Someone willing to stand alone against the system, knowing the backlash will be severe. This doesn't excuse the systems that create these barriers or place the burden on those fighting them, but it acknowledges the reality that progress usually requires people willing to sacrifice for it. Second, there's the lesson about respectability politics and the myth that good behavior earns equality. Johnson's critics, including many in the black community, argued that he should have been more humble, more careful, more aware of how his actions reflected on his race. The implication was that if he'd just behaved better, white America would have accepted him. But history shows this is false. Black Americans who played by the rules, who were humble and respectable, still faced discrimination and violence. The problem wasn't Johnson's behavior. The problem was white supremacy. This lesson resonates today in debates about protest, activism, and how marginalized groups should fight for their rights. The burden is always placed on the oppressed to be perfect, to protest the right way, to not make anyone uncomfortable. But Johnson's story reminds us that the system will find reasons to punish those who challenge it, regardless of how they do it. Perfect behavior doesn't guarantee justice. Third, Johnson's life illustrates the limits of individual success in a systemically unjust society. He reached the pinnacle of his sport, earned wealth and fame, and still couldn't escape racism. He was still refused service at restaurants, still persecuted by the government, still viewed as less than human by much of white America. This teaches us that while individual achievement is important, it's not sufficient. Structural change requires collective action, policy reform, cultural shifts that individual success alone can't accomplish. Fourth, there's a lesson about the weaponization of law. Johnson was prosecuted under the Mann Act, not because he'd committed any real crime, but because the government needed a tool to punish him. This selective enforcement, using law as a weapon against those in power wish to control, continues today. When we see disproportionate prosecution of marginalized communities, mandatory minimums that target specific populations, or laws that seem designed to criminalize certain behaviors more than others, we're seeing the same dynamic Johnson faced. Fifth, Johnson teaches us about the cost of being authentic. He refused to perform humility or hide who he was. He paid an enormous price for this authenticity: exile, imprisonment, persecution, poverty. But he also lived freely in ways most people, especially most black people of his era, never could. Was it worth it? That's a question each person must answer for themselves, but Johnson's answer was yes. He chose freedom over safety, authentic expression over acceptance. Sixth, there's a lesson about historical erasure and recovery. Johnson was deliberately written out of boxing history, his achievements downplayed, his legacy complicated by focus on his conviction rather than his excellence. It took decades of work by historians, activists, and advocates to recover his story and re-establish his rightful place in sports history. This reminds us that history is contested, that marginalized voices and achievements are often erased, and that recovering them requires deliberate effort. Seventh, Johnson's relationship with the Black community teaches us about the complexity of representation. He was simultaneously a hero and a liability, a source of pride and a cause of concern. This tension around representation, how public figures from marginalized communities are received, and the burdens placed on them, continues today. Black athletes, entertainers, and public figures still navigate the impossible task of representing their entire race, of being simultaneously authentic and non-threatening. Eighth, Johnson's story reminds us that progress is neither linear nor permanent. He became champion in 1908, breaking a barrier that had seemed absolute. But the backlash was immediate and severe, and after he lost the title, it would be over 20 years before another Black heavyweight champion emerged. Breaking through doesn't mean staying through. Gains can be rolled back, doors can be closed again, and vigilance is required to maintain progress. Ninth, there's a lesson about allyship and complicity. Tommy Burns, despite being champion, faced enormous pressure to fight Johnson, and eventually did for financial reasons. Some promoters and journalists supported Johnson's right to compete, but the vast majority of white Americans were either actively hostile or complicitly silent. This reminds us that injustice persists, not just because of active racism, but because of the silence and inaction of those who could speak up but don't. 10th, and perhaps most importantly, Johnson teaches us that dignity doesn't require permission. He acted as if he deserved respect, even when society denied it. He lived freely, even when freedom was forbidden. He refused to internalize the hatred directed at him, refused to believe the lies told about his capabilities. This unshakable self-worth in the face of constant dehumanization might be his most powerful legacy. For young people today, especially young Black Americans, Johnson's story offers complicated but valuable lessons. He shows that barriers can be broken, that excellence can't be denied forever, that living authentically is possible even when it's costly. But he also shows the very real price of resistance, the loneliness that comes from standing apart, from walking a path no one else dares to follow. Johnson's story reminds us that change rarely happens with comfort. It comes from friction, from those who refuse to stay silent when silence is demanded. Every generation has its Jack Johnsons, people who speak too loudly, move too boldly, and refuse to apologize for existing in spaces they weren't meant to occupy. They are punished first, then celebrated later. The pattern is so predictable, it's almost a law of history. And yet, it's because of them that the boundaries move. Because of them, the impossible slowly becomes ordinary. The color lines of sport, of politics, of culture, all of them shift when someone pays the price to push them. Johnson's victory was not just a win in a ring. It was a mirror held up to America, forcing it to confront its contradictions. More than a century later, that mirror still stands. When athletes kneel, when artists speak truth to power, when individuals demand equality rather than permission, echoes of Jack Johnson can be heard. The rhythm of a man who refused to bow. His story asks each of us a simple, haunting question. When it's your turn to face the system, will you play along or will you fight on your own terms? Before Jack Johnson became history, he was a man, flawed, brilliant, defiant. But after his death, his name refused to stay buried. It surfaced again and again, each time the world rediscovered its need for his story. In the jazz clubs of Harlem, musicians whispered about him between sets, the boxer who lived like a king when kings weren't allowed to be black, In the 1960s, when Muhammad Ali stood before the world and declared that no one could make him fight a war he didn't believe in, reporters compared him to Johnson. Ali didn't deny it. He said, "I'm the Jack Johnson of my day." The same defiance, the same punishment, the same refusal to apologize. In the 1970s, James Earl Jones brought Johnson's spirit to Broadway in The Great White Hope, and audiences sat in silence as they realized they weren't just watching a boxer. They were watching a man crushed for his courage. Decades later, filmmakers, scholars, and boxers still trace their lineage to him. Every defensive genius who toys with opponents, every athlete who carries swagger that society tries to contain, every public figure who refuses to shrink to fit expectations, they all echo Jack Johnson. But Johnson's story isn't just about pride. It's about the price of integrity in a world built to punish it. He didn't live to see his vindication. He didn't see the pardon that cleared his name, or the museum exhibits that now display his gloves like holy relics. Yet in a way, he never needed to. His real victory wasn't the belt around his waist. It was the idea that once a man knows his worth, no system, no law, no empire can make him forget it. Even now, the photograph endures. Johnson standing over his fallen opponent, calm and unshaken, as if the outcome had been written long before the bell rang. That image has outlived every critic, every lawmaker, every racist headline. It survives because it captures something eternal. A man who refused to know his place, and by doing so, changed where the world's lines were drawn. Jack Johnson's heartbeat still echoes in every athlete who won't stay silent, in every artist who won't conform, in every person who dares to live unashamed. The laughter that once mocked him has long since faded. What remains is the echo of defiance, the sound of gloves against canvas, and the truth he proved over a century ago. They laughed at him until the world had no choice but to stand and applaud.